Okay. Are you ready to dive into a story that's both fascinating and kind of thought-provoking? We're going deep on a case that, gripped the nation back in 2014, the Slender Man stabbing, and we're going to see what's happening now years later.
Oh, absolutely.
So this case, remember, this was when two 12-year-olds, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, they lured their friend into the woods and stabbed her multiple times.
Yeah, and it was the motive that was so unsettling. I mean, this wasn't a, typical childhood dispute.
Right.
They claimed they were acting on orders from Slender Man,
Right.
this fictional online horror figure.
Like an internet boogeyman.
Exactly. And they believed they had to prove their loyalty to him.
It was a total media frenzy, wasn't it? I mean, it raised so many concerns about the internet's influence on young people and what happens when that bleeds into real-world violence.
Right.
So, legally, what happened?
So Morgan Geyser, she was found not guilty by reason of mental defect in 2017.
Okay.
And committed to a mental health facility, the Winnebago Mental Health Institute, for 40 years. But the sentence allowed for conditional release to be considered every 6 months.
Okay.
Anissa Weier, she took a plea deal. It was released back in 2021.
So that kind of brings us up to speed.
Yes.
But here's where it gets really interesting earlier this year. Morgan Geyser, she's 22 now. She was granted conditional release, but there was a snag. The state actually tried to block it at the last minute.
Yes, the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, they stepped in just days before a review hearing was scheduled to argue against the release.
So what was their reasoning? What made them try to reverse course like that all of a sudden?
Well, they cited concerns about two things that Geyser was doing while at Winnebago.
Okay.
First, they brought up a book she was reading, Rent Boy.
Uh-oh.
And it apparently deals with some pretty dark stuff, murder and body parts. And the state argued that this suggested that she was still fixated on violence.
That does sound a little alarming, on the surface at least.
Yeah.
What was the second concern?
Well, this one involved a man who had become fixated on Geyser's case. He had gotten a hold of some of her drawings, which were described as disturbing, and was trying to sell them online.
Oh, wow.
And the state claimed that this was exploitative and that it could put Geyser at risk.
So you've got Geyser trying to reintegrate into society, and then suddenly these two issues kind of pop up.
Right.
Were they legitimate red flags, or was this a total overreaction?
It's a good question.
That's what we're going to unpack.
Yeah, the hearing that followed was quite dramatic.
I bet. Yeah.
You had state officials testifying, painting this picture of Geyser as someone who might still be dangerous if released. And they pointed to the book and her contact with this man as evidence.
Yeah.
But on the other side, you had Geyser's attorney arguing that the state was blowing things way out of proportion.
Right, and that's where the not guilty by reason of mental defect finding comes back into play, right? Because it's not just a punishment, it implies ongoing treatment and evaluation.
Exactly.
So how did her attorney kind of counter these concerns?
Well, her attorney, Tony Cotton, he really hammered home the point that Geyser had been totally upfront about both the book and the man. She willingly disclosed this to her treatment team.
So she was honest.
Which seems to indicate a desire to be honest and transparent.
It's interesting, though, because it's she's being penalized for being truthful.
Right.
So you have to wonder if that sets a bad precedent for other patients who are trying to rehabilitate.
Exactly. Cotton argued that, punishing honesty like that discourages open communication between patients and their care providers.
Right.
Which is essential for successful treatment. He maintained that Geyser had come a long way and was no longer a danger to herself or others.
No, but what about the medical professionals who initially recommended her for release? Did they change their tune at all after this new information came to light?
That's where things get really fascinating, because all three doctors who had supported Geyser's conditional release stood their ground.
Wow, even with the book and the man.
Yeah.
What was their reasoning?
Well, they testified that these new concerns didn't change their professional assessments.
Okay.
They argued that, someone's choice of reading material doesn't automatically reflect violent tendencies. Well, especially, considering that Geyser was engaging in therapy and reading other things like the Bible and books about art and history.
So they were saying, look at the whole picture, not just this one thing.
Right.
What did they say about the man who was trying to sell her art?
Regarding the man, they emphasized that Geyser had cut off contacts with him once she realized his intentions.
Oh, okay.
And they didn't see evidence of her encouraging him or trying to profit from her situation.
So we've got these two very different narratives kind of emerging here. The state is saying, this is risky. Look at these red flags. And the defense is saying she's being honest and making progress. This is an overreaction.
Right.
This must put the judge in a very tough spot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Judge Michael Bohren, who'd overseen the case from the start, had to weigh these conflicting viewpoints and make a very difficult call.
Yeah. So after all that back and forth, what did the judge ultimately decide?
Well, Judge Bohren, he took some time to consider everything he'd heard and then issued his ruling.
Okay.
He decided to uphold Morgan Geyser's conditional release,
Wow.
allowing her to proceed with the plan to move to a group home.
I bet that was a huge relief for Geyser and her legal team.
Oh, absolutely.
I imagine the state wasn't too thrilled about this, though.
Yeah.
This case had so much public attention. I bet they felt a lot of pressure to make sure that nothing went wrong.
Oh, for sure. There was bound to be public scrutiny no matter what the judge decided.
Right.
But Judge Bohren, he laid out his reasoning very clearly, explaining, why he felt confident in upholding the release.
Okay.
He really emphasized the consistent support from the medical professionals.
Yeah, they were the ones who knew her best, right?
Right. They had years of experience working with Geyser, and their opinions held a lot of weight.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did he specifically address the concerns about the book Rent Boy?
He did. He pointed out that the only testimony about the book's content came from a doctor who described it as humorous.
Oh, wow.
And that no one else had actually read it. So their concerns were based more on assumption than a real understanding of the book.
It seems like a pretty key detail if the state was going to use the book as evidence. You would think they would have had someone, analyze it thoroughly, not just react to its title.
You would think.
What about the man who was trying to sell Geyser's artwork? How did the judge factor that into his decision?
Well, Judge Bohren, he focused on the fact that Geyser had cut ties with the man as soon as she realized he was exploiting her situation.
Okay.
He didn't see any evidence that she had encouraged his behavior or sought to profit from her notoriety.
So again, it kind of comes back to her taking responsibility and being proactive. Instead of ignoring the issue, she addressed it head on, which probably worked in her favor. But did the judge acknowledge any potential risks? I mean, even with the conditional release, this was a serious crime, and I'm sure there were people who felt uneasy about her being back in the community.
He did. Judge Bohren was very clear that he understood the gravity of the original crime and the need to balance rehabilitation with public safety.
Okay.
He emphasized that the conditions of Geyser's release would actually be stricter in some ways than her confinement at Winnebago.
Really?
Yeah, she'd be moving to a group home with constant monitoring, regular therapy sessions, and tight restrictions on her activities and interactions.
So it's not like she's just being released without any structure or support.
Right. He even described it as substantial supervision.
So this is a carefully crafted plan with a lot of oversight.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this isn't the end of the story.
Right.
The conditional release plan still needs to be finalized and reviewed by the court.
Okay.
There will be ongoing evaluations to make sure that Geyser's adhering to the conditions and continuing to make progress in her treatment.
So it sounds like a very step-by-step process with a lot of checkpoints along the way.
It is.
So we've covered the crime, the legal outcomes, the state's attempt to block the conditional release, and the judge's reasons for upholding it. But here's what I keep kind of coming back to. Did Geyser's honesty actually hurt her chances? If she had never mentioned the book, or the man would, things have gone more smoothly.
That's a really thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
It really highlights the dilemmas that people face when they're trying to rehabilitate within the legal system.
Right.
You're supposed to be open and honest.
Yeah.
But what happens when that honesty is used against you?
It's almost like a catch-22.
It is.
If being truthful can lead to negative consequences, it makes you wonder if others in similar situations, might be less inclined to be forthcoming in the future.
Right.
And that could create a climate of fear and distrust, which wouldn't be good for anyone.
Exactly. I think that's a very valid concern. This case really exposes the tension between transparency and self-preservation, especially when mental health is involved. And it underscores the need for a system that encourages honesty without fear of reprisal. A system where progress and rehabilitation are truly valued.
I'm also struck by how the media attention surrounding this case might have played a role in the state's decision to fight the release. The Slender Man stabbing was huge news. It seemed like everyone was talking about it. Do you think that public pressure might have influenced their actions at all?
It's certainly possible with a high-profile case like this. There's immense pressure on authorities to appear tough on crime and prioritize public safety, even if that means, potentially undermining the rehabilitation process.
It makes you wonder if in a less publicized case, the state would have reacted the same way to the book and the man. Maybe they felt obligated to kind of take a strong stance because of the level of public scrutiny.
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive observation.
Yeah.
It raises the question of whether justice is truly blind or whether external factors like media attention can sway decisions.
Right.
It also highlights the need for a system that's resilient to public pressure and grounded in evidence-based practices, not emotional reactions.
Another thing that struck me as odd was this whole issue with the book Rent Boy.
Yeah.
It seems like no one, apart from one of the doctors, actually read it.
You're right, the state was raising alarm bells about this book.
Yeah.
But their assessment was based solely on its title and a brief description.
Right.
They hadn't even analyzed the content themselves.
And the doctor who had read the book, Dr. Robbins, was adamant that he didn't find it disturbing or indicative of any violent tendencies on Geyser's part.
Exactly.
He even described it as humorous.
Right, and he pointed out that focusing solely on Rent Boy was taking it out of context.
Yeah.
Geyser was an avid reader with diverse interests, including religious texts, art, and history.
So this one book was just a tiny sliver of her overall reading habits. It seems like a pretty flimsy basis for trying to keep someone confined, especially when you have medical professionals saying it's not a cause for concern.
It does make you wonder if there was something else at play here, where their conscious or unconscious bias might have influenced their perception.
Right.
This case really raises questions about how we assess risk when mental illness is involved. Are we truly looking at the whole picture, or are we allowing preconceived notions to cloud our judgment?
That's a crucial point, and it speaks to the need for greater understanding and awareness around mental health issues.
Yes.
If we're going to have a fair and effective justice system, we need to ensure that decisions are based on evidence and expert evaluation, not fear or speculation.
I couldn't agree more. We need to move beyond simplistic assumptions and embrace a more nuanced approach to mental health within the legal system.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about what happens next for Morgan Geyser. Her conditional release has been upheld, but what does that actually look like in practice? So we know Geyser's conditional release has been approved, but what happens now? Paint a picture for us. What are the next steps?
Well, first they need to hammer out the specifics of her release plan. This document, it'll lay out all the rules and conditions that she has to follow, like which group home she'll be living in, how much supervision she'll have, what kind of treatment she'll continue to receive, and any restrictions on her, movement or who she can contact.
So it's almost like a roadmap for her reintegration, into the community.
Exactly, making sure there's support and accountability every step of the way.
Right, and this plan has to be tailored to her individual needs, right?
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Okay, and then once the court approves it, then Geyser can leave Winnebago and begin this new chapter.
Right.
But she won't just be on her own, right? What kind of support system will she have in place?
No, not at all. She'll have a whole team of professionals, supporting her throughout this transition.
Okay.
Therapists, case managers, maybe even a probation officer, and of course the staff at the group home.
So they'll be working closely with her to kind of help her adjust to life outside the facility.
Exactly. Address any challenges that come up. Make sure she's following all the rules.
It sounds like a pretty comprehensive approach designed to help her succeed and keep everyone safe.
It is.
What about the duration of this conditional release? Is it for a specific amount of time, or is it more open-ended?
That's a detail that will be spelled out in the release plan.
Okay.
It could be for a set period, say a few years, or it could be indefinite with the possibility of eventually, transitioning to even greater independence.
Okay.
It really just depends on how well she's doing and the recommendations of her treatment team.
So it's like a gradual process with the possibility of more freedom down the line if she demonstrates she's ready for it.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But let's be real. There are going to be people who are nervous about this. They remember the, horrifying nature of the crime, and they worry about her being back in the community. So how do we kind of reconcile those concerns with the idea that people can change and deserve a second chance?
Well, those concerns are totally valid. Right. I mean, this was a traumatic event, and it's natural for people to have anxieties about it. But I think it's important to remember that Geyser was a child when this happened.
Right.
And children are incredibly adaptable and capable of significant change, especially with the right support and intervention.
Yeah.
She's received years of intensive treatment for her mental health, and the experts who've been working with her are confident that she's not the same person that she was back then.
So it's about trusting the professionals who have been directly involved in her case.
Yeah.
And have the expertise to assess her progress.
Precisely. And it's about understanding that conditional release isn't about, like, throwing open the doors and hoping for the best.
Right.
It's a carefully considered decision based on professional evaluations designed to balance public safety with the individual's right to rehabilitation.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the legal intricacies to the ethical dilemmas surrounding this case. But stepping back, what does this whole situation tell us about how our society approaches the intersection of mental health and criminal justice?
Well, I think this case really highlights the challenges and complexities of dealing with mental illness within the legal system.
Yeah.
It raises questions about how we assess risk, determine accountability, and balance the need for public safety with the potential for rehabilitation.
Right.
And it also forces us to kind of confront our own biases and assumptions about mental illness and how we treat individuals who have committed crimes while struggling with, these challenges.
It seems like we're still grappling with how to create a system that is both just and compassionate.
Yes.
A system that recognizes the nuances of mental health and supports individuals on their path to recovery.
Absolutely. We need to ensure that our responses are informed by evidence, empathy, and a deep understanding of the challenges people face. We need to invest in mental health resources, both within the justice system and in the broader community.
Yeah.
And we need to challenge the stigma surrounding mental illness so that people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it.
This case is a reminder that these issues are all interconnected.
Yes.
And that finding solutions requires a multifaceted approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This case isn't just about Morgan Geyser. It's about all of us.
Yeah.
It's about how we as a society choose to address mental illness, define justice, and create a world that is both safe and supportive for everyone.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the Morgan Geyser case, what are some key takeaways you'd like our listeners to consider?
I think it's important to remember that this is a complex case with no easy answers.
Right.
And it highlights the need for ongoing dialogue about mental health and criminal justice.
Yeah.
It also underscores the importance of media literacy, particularly in the age of the internet.
Right.
The Slender Man myth had a profound impact on this case, demonstrating how online content can blur the lines between fantasy and reality, especially for young people.
That's a crucial point. We need to equip ourselves and future generations with the critical thinking skills to navigate this, ever-evolving digital world and to discern fact from fiction.
Absolutely. And on more individual level, I think this case encourages us to approach these issues with both empathy and a willingness to engage in, thoughtful discussion.
Right.
It reminds us that even in the face of tragedy and wrongdoing, there's always potential for growth, healing, and hope.
Those are powerful takeaways. And for our listeners, we encourage you to continue grappling with these questions, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to engage in constructive conversations about how we can create a more just and compassionate world for all.
We've journeyed together through this deep dive, exploring the depths of a case that continues to raise important questions. It's a story about the power of belief, the complexities of mental health, and the potential for both harm and redemption. And as we conclude, we leave you with the enduring message of hope. Hope for healing, for understanding, and for a future where compassion and justice prevail.